Hi everyone, this is Chen. I'm a cultural historian for early medieval Europe and late medieval China, among many other things. And welcome to yet another new episode of Versucher. And today, with me to discuss some selected comments from you, is my good friend Aran. How are you doing, Aran?
I'm doing fine, Tran. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. What we're gonna do today, I'm happy to be doing this with Tran. And this is a different type of episode, right? And just a very short pretext of why we're doing this, what is this about, and then just jumping into it. Uh, to be honest, when we first started for Zuha, we thought that we need at least, I don't know, 50 videos to get any sort of a substantial feedback. And what we care for here is that kind of a substantial kind of conversation. And to our surprise, we received a lot of interesting responses very early on. We were so happy about that, and we're so thankful about that. And it is important for us to let you know that, like, this project, the Versucher is a project because we think a pivotal social space does not exist in our times. That's our problem. We have a problem. We get stuck in this world that is either too, in the academic world, too careeristic, too just like boring and mediocre, despite its values, and that becomes a social space. It's just uninspiring, like space. And other spaces become intellectually thin, that they're not even engaging. They're just like they want to come up with like immediate solutions and self-help structure. That type of a community. We want a community. That's our purpose. We're not just communicating with each other and recording it. We are very much interested in expanding this and using this opportunity to like create a community of in-depth intellectual conversation that is not tied to the uninspiring, curious aspects of the academic work. So keep doing this, and this is our proof of how we appreciate this. We have selected some of the comments that you have left so far under our episodes, and to engage with and respond to as much as we can. And of course, we picked the ones that we thought we have something meaningful to say, um, just in general. Um, if like if it wasn't like that, if it was just like just a general thank you and praise and whatever we would reply to you, we appreciate you. But these are just the comments that have like some claim in them. So let's delve into them. The way this is going to work out, and this is we are open for suggestions. This is how we're going to do it this time, right? We've got comments. We're gonna as a slides, and we put the full comment there. We won't read all of them. We just summarize them. But if you want to read them, pause the video and read them, and then we respond to them. That's how we're going to do it, and we might develop thing as we go. All right. So the first set of comments that we have put together, they're under different videos. They're just like kind of thematically connected. That's why they are together. Um, Basically, you could say like it's about like the transitions
Mhm.
in Hegel's science of logic. Like what is it to talk about the transition between being and to nothing? And uh, two of these are coming from Hans, and one is coming from Diegetic, if that's how I should pronounce that. So the point that Hans is saying, from what we understand, is that the movement, especially Hans seems to be interested in the movement from uh, being to nothing.
Right.
Uh, And he wonders, like, because I think, like, related to this kind of thinness of Holge's explanation, like, what is this movement even, right? And what he's asking here is that whether this movement could be thought of as something psychological. Now, we have talked about, like, the details of what we think about these movements and the problems that we see. Number one, definitely Hegel wouldn't say that it is psychological. Number two, I don't think it is psychological if you think about psychological in a very, like, in a literal way, right? It's just like get tired of, being, and then becomes nothing, like some sort of a psychological in a very, like, awkward way. If you're thinking about psychological as something more about human psychology, then I think there are good, interesting things that could be said, which we have pointed at here and there. But, like, right now, this came to my mind about, like, this point that we talked about. Trent mentioned the point about, like, the communication, right? Communication as a, human demand, right? And also a presupposition for making these movements to happen. Well, if that's a psychological demand, then part of the movement from being a nothing is about satisfying that psychological demand. But this is where we don't have the final answer to this, right? But I think it's interesting to think about this as a potentially psychological issue. Diegetic was critical of our understanding of, like, the transition, using the word transition, collapse from being to nothing. I think this is more so a semantic issue in terms of, like, the substance. I don't see anything, like, fundamentally problematic here. When I say transition, or we have said transition, is like following Holgate. It's about making something implicit explicit. Now, we're not saying transition in terms of, like, I transitioned from this department to another department. Like, it's not that type of transition. It's just like, I thought I am so and so, but I realize I'm this and that, right? That's kind of that transition. Like, transition in terms of, like, some realization that what I thought, what I was, I am not just that, or I'm not that at all. You want to call it transition, like transition, that's fine. The idea is that, like, the idea of collapse is the same thing, the collapse of not being, but collapse of that conception of being. Now, being ends up being so and so. So I think Holgate's emphasis on implicit to explicit transition, that's the transition that is what we're talking about. That's what I got for these series of comments. Do you have anything to
Yes, I
add
just
to
want to
these?
quickly connect to what we are dealing with here. Thank you, first of all. I never got the opportunity to acknowledge my gratitude to the generosity of your time and the attention. Yes, the very occasionally will we have such substantial and blunt, sometimes like inspiring comments on YouTube channel. So the first, with regard to the psychology, I think, if I understand you right, I think you're thinking maybe perhaps in Nietzsche's term. Didn't Nietzsche call himself the philosophical psychologist instead of like a philosopher in the traditional sense? So in the sense that if we're addressing certain intellect that remain unsatisfied or certain restless soul thing, I think it's definitely, I'm with Aran. I think it's way more to be developed here, because as we mentioned in our previous episode, that there's certain will to remember, will to communicate, implicitly present in the whole momentum of movement, to the extent one is even invited to use the word teleology or telos, as Aran did in our previous episode. So you're absolutely on the right track there, but we do not really know the full picture yet, and we should perhaps, I don't know, be attentive to those moments where such will memory or psychology creeps into the what market itself as a purely immanent, purely logical enterprise. So this is a very good callback. And for diegetic, I think I have a similar point in the sense that first of all, we have two versions of the being nothing transition. One is the Hoge's interpretation, the other is ours, and we do not necessarily share his, as Aran put it, the pepping Hoge debate situation. I think we have made that very clear in previous episodes. I think we can move on now to
Yeah, very good. So the next comment, we just wanted to acknowledge this from, I don't know, Sinodelian.
yes.
This you guys have interesting names here. We really appreciate this comment. This is just a good list of readings based on different parts of Hegel's projects, like different like secondary literature. And as the time comes and we get interested in different parts of this, we definitely will consult this list in uh, picking our next direction. So I think that's about that. Now we have Jean-Michel. Jean-Michel, whoever you are, we love you. Just keep doing what you're doing as first thing. We love seeing your comments, and yeah, not only just because of your level of engagement, your attention, but also like your substantial contribution, not just simple appreciation, but just about that. Fascinating. Now, Jean-Michel has 3 comments, and all of them are lengthy. And as I said, we just show you different slides at different times, and you can pause and read the whole thing. I'm just going to stop at the last slide for now, just to talk about it, but just think about it as that. This is the same. This is a 3-page long comment. And I will tell you, I will summarize what it is. If you need more details to kind of get into the depth of what Jean-Michel is talking about here, feel free to pause it and look at that. So Jean-Michel is talking about a couple of things in this comment. And I think the core of it is just very bluntly and broadly speaking, is the question of how universal is Hegel's project, right? Which is something that we have talked about. And this comment was left when we were talking about this in a more, like we were saying that it could be universal. And like we were trying to kind of defend it from the very basic like criticism that it cannot be. Now, Jean-Michel mentions a couple of things in this comment, and it continues in other comments that are all very important. So one is the point about like something like agency, right? And a point that Hegel admits that agency wasn't available to the Greeks, or that's not how they functioned, right? And agency is available to moderns, right? That's a difference that matters. Okay. And alongside that, because that matters, something like language matters as well. Not language as some sort of a like, amalgamation of grammatical rules, but language as culture, right? And this, with this, Jean-Michel invokes Gadamer again, that Hegel's project is not just about coming up with some universal, truths about concepts. It's about making something that has been embedded in the German language clear or explicit. And what Jean-Michel is saying that this is not, universal, right? But that doesn't mean it is any less important than anything universal, right? This kind of a cultural articulation itself is very much valuable, right? And also, like, there are other levels, other layers of what Jean-Michel has here about the relationship between faith and knowledge, and how that also could be in play. It's in a similar way that, like, being embedded in language could be. Like, this is an important point. And first of all, if Jean-Michel, you have specific books or anything from papers from Gadamer that you recommend, we want to hear that. It would be great if you mention that to us. Here I am with Jean-Michel in the sense that even if this is not about a universal understanding of concepts, this could be very valuable. I think that's I'm 100% with him there. My hesitation about this kind of the cultural distinction, or like cultural like isolationism, is that just because the Greeks did not have access to the concept of agency, that doesn't mean that the truths that people who have access to the concept of agency, the truth that those people arrive are not applicable to the Greeks. Like, here I will push back in the sense that just because this is happening as a cultural event doesn't make the conclusions of it limit to that culture only. And that, I think, was what I was trying to or that was what I was trying to claim with, like, the parallel with quantum mechanics. Like, it, of course, there is, like, the articulation of quantum mechanics happens only within certain cultural contexts. That doesn't mean that a isolated tribe in the Amazons, suddenly the laws of quantum mechanics do not apply to them. They don't have access to them, right? So this being a cultural exploration does not mean that it's not a universal judgment, right? I'm not saying Hegel was successful in doing this. I'm just saying, just because there are cultural differences, and this might be dependent on the cultural context that Hegel was talking about, the results of which could be still applicable universally. Now, we talked about this last time. We probably will talk about it more and more. That doesn't mean that this is exhaustive, right? And I think that is the part that I definitely agree with Jean-Michel, that because this is a cultural self-explanation at a very deep level, the presumptions of that culture find their way there, right? And that means that there might be a cultural exploration coming from a very different culture that is both universal and also in our blind side, in our, Hegelian blind side. Right? So that's what I have. About this comment. Trent, what do you have?
Right. First of all, I'm just very out of depth while reading your comment, because you refers to very authoritative, and I'm sure it comes from your years of learning erudition, referring to things that I have no clue about. So if just second around, if you have specific articles, chapters, or books to recommend about, like, Gadamer or any other figures mentioned in your comments, feel free to leave them. We will try to prioritize them, and so that we can provide, perhaps in the future, more substantive conversations with regard to that. And maybe a little bit follow-up on the Greek cultural relativism to a certain extent, that the universal versus the cultural differences part. I think one way I think this project is meaningful to, at least in our time, to everybody, in the sense the concept of modernity as a global project is relevant. regardless of whether this specific form of modernity comes from a specific culture, that to do justice and to find a place for our diverse, the pre-modern culture's legacy in this time of ours, that we need to entertain certain extra-cultural specific parameters of translating and evaluating cultural achievements. I think that's why sometimes it could be beneficial to use categories, terms derived from Hegel's project as a helpful means of reference when we are comparing different cultural expressions and assumptions across time and space. So that's what I have to say on that. With Gaudium, very much so, like history, language, like Hegel cannot be separated from his cultural social conditions, and we are still thinking through how to balance the claim of timelessness and the universality in his the science of project, the science of logic project, and the situatedness of him as an historical individual or figure. Yes, that's all I have to say.
Very brief on what you said, because I think that's like very much related to what I tried to push across. Like, if the demand of cultural comparative projects among cultures is a demand, right? If that's what we want to do, some cultures are better. Some thinkers within some cultures may be better in providing frameworks to do that than others. And that's the part about the quote unquote universal. That itself, that realization of the other, ability to appreciate and conceptualize the other itself is coming from a culture, right? That itself is a result of that culture. And that is not a trivial thing. Yeah. So with second comment from Jean-Michel, which I would do the same thing. It's 2 pages, so I will go to the second page. You can pause and read the whole thing. The idea is the same, and I don't have much to say, but it's about Wittgenstein here, and the difference between depth grammar and surface grammar, and like this idea of this kind of a cultural autobiography that is inherent, or it could be inherent to Hegel's project as well. And the only thing that I would say is that yes, like we can think about Hegel as this kind of depth grammar, and then also think about its limitations in terms of like being the cultural self-anthropology, like very much related to language, like we have talked about, like natural language over and over again, how it influences the whole intellectual process. But I would just say what I said with response to Gadamer as well. Like the depth grammar, quote unquote, the depth grammar of the cultural heritage of German intellectualism is not just limited to that space, although it is happening within that space, right? Just because this is self-exploration, just, like think about autobiographies or biographies in general, right? That's how I'm thinking about that. Like you read a biography of a, Chinese intellectual in 19th century, right? And we're not in 19th century, we're not in China, right? But that biography seems to, and we don't necessarily come up with a universal understanding of this is how intellectuals work. That's just what it is. Something a lot more than what intellectuals were doing in 19th century China, if the biography is good, right? It's a similar thing that I am thinking here, that despite all of our distinctions, we are related. That doesn't mean we are reducible to one another, but it's also that relation matters, right? So I resist this archipelago of isolated culture vision, that, oh, this is just our biography, I'm not saying Jean-Michel is saying that. I'm just saying that that's the thing that I'm resisting against. That I think that kind of inquiry into the biography of a intellectual biography of a group of people is not limited to that. The value of that is not limited to that group of people. So even if Hegel's science of logic is depth grammar in Wittgensteinian sense, it doesn't mean it is only depth grammar of so and so, and it could be with qualification universal in all sorts of ways.
Yes, very much in line with what you said, Aran, that it's sometimes a good cultural history done in biographical form is very different from a forensic study of a historical individual, because by empathizing, sympathizing with, and trying to imagine the possible options available to that individual in any given moment of his or her life, we know much about the social, economic, as well as cultural conditions of its environment. And then those things are not unique to him, but also are not you available to everybody who shares one or some identity of that person. So it's a thing by examining particulars, we are able to infer certain thing particular about that culture, but also perhaps if we do it the right way, perhaps inferring something supernatural structure of like the making of cultural possibilities. And in that sense, in so doing, we are not just doing a isolated study or examination of one species, but we are perhaps invited to speculate at least the interpenetration or interconnectivity or mutual constitution between this specific case and many other cases, because follow that archipelago of history or whatever a culture analogy, we must be reminded that they are all connected as part of the Earth's shell underneath the sea level. So trying to, even though perhaps that's beyond our horizon, we couldn't observe them, but we should not stop from imagining them. Of course, I'm not saying, Jean-Michel, that's your position, but I'm just saying these are our clarifying reflections that are prompted and enabled by your very discerning comment. So thank you very much. I will definitely try to find time to read more Wittgenstein and Gadamer, because I didn't know that they were so important to the whole process, like project that I want to do in the long run. Yes, thank you again.
Yeah, and the last comment from Jean-Michel is actually on like Nietzsche, Hegel, and the point that we were trying to make, that even someone Nietzsche who is suspicious of the value of truth or wants to cast doubt on the value of truth, or thinks people have already just assumed the value of truth and we shouldn't do that, even we claim that even Nietzsche should be on board with Hegel's project, because to reevaluate truth you need to know what truth is, and Hegel's science of logic is very much attempting to reveal that, right? Jean-Michel's point is that, sure, but we can think about this whole process that is happening in science of logic, like with a slight, like a little bit of like a pessimistic view, and then it definitely is not something that Nietzsche would, or Nietzsche or anyone who is sympathetic to Nietzsche would want to pursue. And that's to understand that, like, going back, this is all based on this whole thing about Gadamer, about Wittgenstein, about this whole thing that, Hegel was dealing with concepts. Concepts are happening within language. Language is formed through communication. Communication happens amongst all sorts of people. And if we want to add the Nietzschean side of this, like the conventions of language, like other conventions, are the types of creations that happen amongst the, even most mediocre human beings. So the concepts that we have, the concepts that we deal with, are like anything that is communicable through concepts. I remember Nietzsche saying somewhere, it is kind of like, watered down. That's the word that I want to say. Watered down version of reality, right? Because it needs to be communicable to everyone. It's just like me trying to, I think this will explain like what he is saying, I think what Jean-Michel is getting at. And that, like, if I want to explain like quantum mechanics to everyone, right? And to a person who's not very, like, whatever, intellectually gifted, or not in the position of really understanding, I gotta like turn this into something that is very, very simplified and very, very like kind of cut the corners, just very basic idea. I cannot even go into the depth of what quantum mechanics is. I think the same thing could happen with language in general. That language is the domain of communication for, in Heidegger's language, das Man, or just everyone, every man, like everyone is there. And because of that, and on top of that, it also has this kind of like, creation of metaphors, creation of icons, creation of pathways that are responding to the psychological state of an average person in the society, right? And Nietzsche has a problem with all of that. Like Nietzsche would be like thinking that this space of communication is in direct contrast with this kind of Dionysian, like appropriation of life, appropriation of the groundlessness of existence, right? And that kind of like eruption and madness that is not necessarily linguistic, but it is coming from the basis of life itself. That is kind of, not there. It's just kind of, it's not marked, it's not presented in language. Now think back on Hegel, and we have already mentioned this, that Hegel was just obsessed with this articulability in language, right? And Nietzsche is going to look at this and say, look, wait a minute. What you're doing is to kind of like maybe clarify, categorize, put together concepts. But look what concepts are. Concepts are happening over there, and they could have value on their own. And Nietzsche doesn't deny that at all. But you really are not looking at this other truth. Just like Hegel cannot understand the response of dancing to thinking of being as pure immediacy, he cannot understand that life. He doesn't have room for that life. And because of that, he doesn't have room for an exhaustive view of truth. Now, I'm combining what we said with what Jean-Michel said, which we said last time in our criticism, and what Jean-Michel said, but I think I was faithful to the basic point there. Now, I'm sympathetic to this view insofar as we accept that Hegel is kind of caught up in this unjustified presupposition. The only hesitation that I have is that I think that's like thinking of language and concepts as just this kind of a plebeian, secondary, tame, timid aspect of human existence is not a justified claim. I understand the possible suppressive capacity of communicative presuppositions, right? But I don't think Nietzsche has that view of language even. So granted that there is a leftover part for Hegel about truth, about, limit of concepts, all that, right? Given that there is that room, I still think that there is a lot to be known that could be pivotal for a Nietzschean thinker. And Nietzsche himself mentions, I forgot the exact section in Beyond Good and Evil, that, like this kind of a high person, if they think of this plebeian world as something unworthy and useless, and think of themselves as the better one, rightfully in many ways, and go and like um kind of confine themselves in a citadel, they're not born to know, because the point is to just actually go and interact and then know the plebeian, know the lower psychological ranks, know their means of communication, know their satisfaction. All of that is part of the process. So I think there's still that uh, the interest, the Nietzschean interest, I think remains in place.
Yes, I have 3 points. I really like this comment because I got a lot of inspirations. Some are like directly reacting to addressing Jean-Michel's point. Some are basically parallels observed in other fields of studies. For instance, the point you mentioned, Jean-Michel mentioned, the violence versus love as two-way to see like the invitation to a dialogue, whatever. And we see the same parallel in memory studies. And in terms of cultural memories preservation, some scholars followed Nietzsche. I haven't read Nietzsche firsthand, but like read their secondhand interpretation of Nietzsche is collective memories are ascribed onto individuals through violence. Like that's how the way, say, ancient Jewish people in reaction to the Babylonian captivity canonized their memory because they are facing of, say, cultural genocide that have been transported into Babylon and forced to learn a foreign tongue. Therefore, they try to turn their memory into, so in face of violence, pass down certain memories so that it preserve cultural identity in face of imperial project. But the other way to look at the same thing is it's a sense of an emotional indebtedness to those who paved the ground, to conditioned our current social as well as cultural positions. We are passing down certain thoughts and certain stories, not just because it's a will to power to dominate people or to subjugate their stories to ours, but rather it's a way to share the way our cultural groundedness with our, say, descendants. And that is not necessarily exclusive with the exercise of power, or because if you take a postmodern view, everything's political, you can justify that way. But perhaps the one act does not have to be exclusively defined in one specific postmodern view. The second point is the herd animal thing. That is really interesting because some scholars of religion as well as theorists of a society, I have Eliade and Emile Durkheim in mind, would agree with Nietzsche on that, but they would think it's a good thing. The only thing we have society of moral community at the beginning, human beings that could survive precisely because there are certain set apart sacred symbols to which we forever return to. And that's the like foundation of human existence. And of course, Nietzsche could like flip it around. That's why individuals are like dissolved into society, dissolved into the collective. But I observe certain parallel there in sociology or studies of religion, that you still have the debate between, say, it is something really such a symbolic exchange is something liberating to amplifying individual singular expression, or is purely conformative for the construct of power structure or solidarity. And the final thing I have this, I don't know, it's just a hunch in the sense that you find a sentence that said that Nietzsche must make the choice in his own absurdity. There seems a certain, I don't know, assumption about autonomous self there, which reminds me of the relationship between enlightenment and counter-enlightenment. As we launched our whole channel with Isaiah Berlin's the critiques of counter-enlightenment, they, Hamann and Herder and Vico, they all take on certain enlightenment assumptions and then use them to criticize other parts they have problem with. I think this is what happens here. Like Nietzsche takes a certain part of things as grounded and like proven and use it to for instance, here's like individuality, perhaps, I don't know, and question Hegel's project, which tries to provide a logical foundation for that individual self-consciousness and I don't know, mutual constituting relationship between individual and the collective, be it like the society or other whatever. So I don't think Nietzsche could, I haven't read Nietzsche firsthand, disclaimer, could argue that the defense, this kind of anticipating or perhaps just an early stage of existentialist claim is at least metaphysically as ambitious as Hegel's science of logic, even though that probably isn't what he was after, but this is just a thought. But thanks very much again for the very insightful comment, which forced me to draw such like unconventional connections, I suppose.
Yeah, I think this is great. Just very, very, very short thing based on what you said is that, yeah, I think there's something there about like all of this that Nietzsche says presupposes a relation between individual and society, for instance, right? And I think like the project that Hegel has is a lot about like reevaluating all of those relations as well.
Right.
So I think that is another part of this relevant. That if Nietzsche, it's not just about truth as this kind of a concept of that kind, but like this whole deal about the relation between individual and universal, it's something that I don't think any serious student of Nietzsche could be could just let go of that easily. All right, last is not a good comment on YouTube. It's an email to me from my former student and dear friend Cecilia, and the points that Cecilia are mentioning again, you can pause the video and like read the whole thing, but a lot of them we have already discussed, right? One thing is about purity and impurity as opposed to immediacy and non-immediacy, right? I think that's the part that we haven't maybe equivocated in one place. The way that I understand, like, what is, okay, we say being is pure immediacy, then what is impure mediation? Like, what is the opposite of that? I think purity is about absolute isolation. When I say something is pure, it means that it is absolutely not other, not this other thing, right? It is pure. It doesn't have the other in it. If there are two things in the world and both of them are pure, that means that neither of them has anything of the other in itself. They're absolutely isolated. So there is archipelago without the shell of the universe. It's just, they're not connected in any way, right? It's pure. Impure means that there is a connection, and then we need to figure out what that connection is. And the moment of the loss of purity in Hegel is in the move from becoming to determined being. Then we enter impurity. In the sense, we realize that being and nothing are not these absolute things, absolute pure different things. We thought they are connected, which means they're impure. That's how I understand. Immediacy and mediation, to me, like the way that I understand like mediation. What is it to say that mediation? I understand it in the context of like something like experience, right? If someone says that we are like immediately experiencing the world, that means that they're just like, it's just coming. It's just coming. I'm getting it. And maybe I'm like attaching names to it, but I'm just seeing the world as it is and just coming in through nothing. The opposing, the contrasting view would be someone like Kant, that would say that you can never experience anything unless through a mediation of a whole set of categories and, you know, intellectual activity. It's not like a blank slate that, like, you know, someone throws an ink and now suddenly is on that slate there is ink. That's not what experience is. It is mediated through a process. It is always processed. It's never immediate. Now, I am not sure where immediacy ends. I wanted to say that immediacy ends with the concept of something, but take that with a grain of salt. I'm not sure, because that's where, like, some level of self-relation comes to view, and I think that is the type of complication that, like, we must let go of immediacy. Something is not what it is just because what it is, but it goes through this process. It is what it is, right? That's how I understand that difference. The point about, like, there's a point about indeterminacy and determinacy, and I will actually read that part, the second part. Cecilia writes, how is it even possible to say that indeterminacy or determinacy is a claim if we cannot reveal it as a determined thing? Is it not possible to either defend or refute even attacks that are or would be internal? I think more about the determined as indeterminate might help. So I'm not entirely sure what this is asking, but I think, like, the point about determined as indeterminate is, to me, that indeterminacy itself is a state, right? Like, indeterminacy itself is not fully what it says it is, right? Indeterminacy is not fully indeterminate because it is something that we call indeterminate. I think this is a dynamic that is happening there, that in all sorts of ways it kind of repeats itself, that this being and nothing coming together, meshing together, just existing in one another, determinacy and indeterminacy also have that type of an interplay. Again, I'm just, because I'm not sure about that line of interpretation that we are pursuing, I think I will postpone talking about this more later on. The last thing is about memory. We have talked about it extensively. There's something interesting about it, that Cecilia is wondering if, like, thinking about it as something temporal, right? Like, if we imply memory, we're implying time. And as a side note, for those of you who are interested, Hegel thinks that concept of change is prior to concept of time, right? So just because there's some change happening doesn't mean there's time, according to Hegel. But yeah, I don't know. Temporality to me is there. I can understand the temporality of memory in the context of the necessity for telos that we discussed last time. That when attending to when something happened and retaining that and bringing it to present, right, requires a telos. That's definitely a temporal act in the sense that what happened to being and nothing was before what happened to, becoming. And unless there is that kind of an order in place, the memory is not going to work. The memory is very much related to these kind of steps. Is that about time? I'm not sure. But it is about order. That order matters. But what is the difference between order and time? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just briefly on the final point. It's those are wonderful questions. And if our conjuration of the term memory has any meaning to itself, I think that Hegel's project has a lot other fields to have conversation with. And for instance, the Nicholas Luhmann's system is similar to Hegel here. Time comes only after social systems are in place with its self-referential system. So just like what you said, for Hegel, logical conditions precede the concept of time, if I understand it correctly. And for Nicholas Luhmann, for a social system to exist, that precedent seeking what comes before and telling the order apart is baked into its existence, but to generate information and the time, or time is a kind of a measurement with coexisting with information or meaning inside the system, comes much later. So they could be disentangled. But of course, if we use the more layman's approach towards the concept of time, logical preconditioning and temporal proceeding, they always go hand in hand. So connecting with our like general human psyche again, like how are they connected? I'm not very clear, but I think that these are very interesting questions to bear in mind and try to draw connection perhaps between Hegel's project with other like lines of research or thinking. Yes, that's what I have to say.
Yes. And with that, I think we have come to an end to this episode. Again, we really appreciate this is not just we're absolutely sincere in this. We want this, we we need this, and we invite you to keep doing this, and we will have episodes of this kind, um as a reward of anyone who is thinking more communally about this space, in the sense that, like, not just leaving a comment, right? It's about even like following the
Right.
whole space. Is that's what we are after. um I think that's it. Thank you very much, Trent, and this was fun to me, hopefully to you and listeners as well. We will be back in some time. We need to read more of Nietzsche, Hegel, sorry,
Yes.
and we will probably end Hoge's book, opening of Hegel's Logic, and we'll read till the part that he covers there, and we will take a break from Hegel after that, and we will work on other stuff, and work on creating other stuff and reading other books. And after that, at some point, probably we'll come back to Hegel and delve more into his weird world. Yeah.
Right. I'm excited and good to reconvene with you all, and we're deeply grateful and see you next time.